Sorry I got cut off before. We're going to try to finish quickly. I'm going to do without the animations to try to make it a little more aware of the timing. The Gemara is made up of three parts, as we talked about in class. There's the quotes from the Mishnah, Torah Tanaim, the world of Mishnayot, not just what we call Mishnah, Memra, the halakhic rulings of the Amoraim, as well as Stam of the Gemara, the narrator who has no name in the Gemara, that framework which the Amoraim created to have the conversation wherein they can make their point. It's really what's interesting about the Stam of the Gemara is you can really have a conversation again between people that never met each other, never knew each other, maybe never even lived at the same time period, because it's really an artificial conversation being created by the Stam of the Gemara. And again, remember that Mishnayot and Memras, generally speaking, are in Hebrew, whereas the Stam of the Gemara, which is in Aramaic, it's a good way to see where we flip from one to the other. We have to talk a little bit about Bali versus Yerushalmi. Most of the Amoraim lived in Bavel. Some remained in Eretz Israel after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The Bavli is generally what is learned and accepted because it is considered to be more authoritative, both in the terms of there being greater scholars there, as well as halacha kebatrai, which is basically a concept that says that all things being equal will follow the later authority, assuming that the later authority had everything the early authority had in front of them, plus additional information if they were to change that which was followed. The Gemara's authority, speaking of which, is something that we don't argue with. Why? Simply because it was accepted by all of Klal Yisrael. So even though there may be some laws, some halachot that seem outdated or socially unacceptable in today's day and age, we can't just simply throw the bath out with throw everything out and say this no longer applies. We require a Sanhedrin to change the halachot. And so there are many areas where if we, L'tzarenu harav, if we had a Sanhedrin today, perhaps some things would be different, perhaps some things would be a little bit more palatable. Now we get to the most important part here, which is actually the breakdown of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Just like Torah Sheba'al has three elements, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, there are five elements to what is included in Torah Sheba'al Peh. They are Perushim Mekubalim, Halacha LeMoshe Misinai, Drashot Chazal, Gzeirot, and Takanot. And we're going to go through each one individually. Perushim Mekubalim basically means the explanations Hashem gave to Moshe. When Hashem explained to him, this is what this pasuk means. They are hinted to in the psukim or derived logically from the psukim, and these are things that there is no argument with the translations or explanation of the text. The most clear example is the one we already mentioned in our class, which is that ayin tachat ayin is not literally an eye for an eye, but rather monetary compensation. That is one example of the idea of Perushim Mekubalim, a definition or a translation or explanation of the text, which was given to Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai, and we do not argue with. Now, second, Halacha Moshe Sinai, we also mentioned briefly, these are laws that were given to Moshe directly, even though there is no overt or covert reference to them in the Torah. There's no pasuk that refers to this halacha, and these two have no arguments. Everyone agrees this is Misorah Ish Mipi Ish Moshe Rabbeinu, and the best example of this is the shape of tefillin. It says you have to have tefillin, doesn't say anything about the description of them. How do we know tefillin are supposed to be black? How do we know they're supposed to be square? That is all based on halacha LeMoshe Misinai. Shashot Chazal are the majority of laws discussed in the Gemara. And these are the logical derivations that Chazal made based on the 13 exegetical tools, the Yod Gimel Midot Torah and Jesha Behen, the tools of which were given to Moshe Rabbeinu, but how they were used or when they apply is subject to debate. And that is where we have machloket, and that is the reason the Gemara will often ask, what is at the core of an argument? What is at the root of an argument? What is the reasoning behind someone's opinion? What is the nafkamina? Because the Gemara is trying to get to how they understood. How did they get to the point that they're discussing? How did they get to that opinion? Where did they get it from the psukim? How did they derive it? Really, the question comes up, why Hashem really wants it to be this way? Why is there a debate? I want to spend very little time on this. There's a famous story of Tanur Shalachnai where there was a debate between two rabbis as to whether this oven could or could not become tamei. The most important thing is just to know is that the dissenting opinion, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hurkin, has basically stood up and gave all sorts of signs. A tree moved, uprooted itself and moved. A river started running the wrong direction. The walls of the Beit Midrash started falling down. There was a bat kol, a heavenly voice that came out of Shamayim saying that he was right. And the person representing the majority opinion, Rabbi Yoshua, got up and said, stop. He told the walls of the Beit Midrash to stop. Lo b'shamayim he. The Torah is not in the heaven. God gave it to us to determine the halacha and whether or not and everything else is irrelevant. We don't pass him based on a bat kol, based on a heavenly voice, and Hashem declared Nitzchuni Banai, which literally means my children have defeated me. Rav Soloveitchik wanted to translate it slightly differently. My children have eternalized me. That the eternality of Torah is based on this debate, based on this idea that we can be part of the conversation, that we are not merely accepting of the halacha, but we are actually fashioners and partners with God in the halachic process. However, it can't just be an ordinary person to do this. You have to be a pro. You have to know what you're doing, and that's the idea of smicha. Now, smicha today is not the smicha they had then. Smicha then was the unbroken chain, Moshe to his student, Ish Mipi Ishi Moshe Rabbeinu, person to person from Moshe Rabbeinu. That chain was broken. It can be reinstituted. In fact, there was attempts to reinstitute it, but for our purposes now, the smicha we have today is not the same smicha, so we are not allowed to make inferences or to learn things out of the Pesukim using the 13 exegetical tools. We are kind of stuck with what we got, but that's in terms of that. And why Torah Shebechtav, on the other hand, is so unclear. So then there's a number of approaches. I don't want to belabor the point, but it is by design. As Gemara discusses that it's that way on purpose. The whole idea we had of the map and decoder, that Hashem gave the map to everybody, but not everyone has the decoder ring, and that the idea for Klal Yisrael to be able to decode the Torah, even though everyone has access to it, that we partner with Hashem in the creation of Jewish law, which we just mentioned, the idea of the Beit HaLevi, and the idea and the concept that it's a living and breathing organism. It's not something that is fixed like the words in the Torah, but rather it can accommodate human input. It can continue to live and breathe. Something that's really an important idea. I don't want to belabor the point, but just as an example, a sukkah can be made of anything, right? As long as it fits the parameters, just like you could fit anything into x plus y equals 25. X plus y could be a lot of different things. In fact, there's infinite possibilities. So too when it comes to sukkah, as long as it fits the parameters of the formula, as long as it fits the rules, that's okay. And that's kind of why the system was created the way it was. Okay, that's just a slight side point in terms of why it was set up this way. Okay, the last two elements of Torah Sheba'al Peh, Gzeirot, which are basically decrees, lo ta'asez, that were created by Chazal in order to protect the Torah. And they were given that permission because it says Asu Siag LaTorah. It's actually written in that same Mishnah we quoted earlier, in the first Mishnah, Perkei Avot, where it tells us the Shalshel Tam HaKabbalah, the Shalshel Tam HaTorah, that the rabbis were imbued with a certain power to protect Torah. I like to look at it kind of like when you go into a museum and you go and see a beautiful work of art, so you're not allowed to go and touch the work of art. In fact, they put up a little rope line to make sure you can't get close enough to touch it. The same thing is true of the Torah. We don't want you to make a mistake, and so we draw a barrier. We make a rope line to keep you a little bit further away from the halacha, and we make these gzeirot. Sometimes there will be debate as to whether something is necessary or not. For example, there was debate as to whether chicken should be considered meat or if it should be considered pariv. We have accepted the halacha that chicken has the same status as meat. And there are many other examples like that. Once it has been accepted, again, it cannot be rescinded even by a Navi. It requires a Sanhedrin, as we discussed before. And the last is takano, which is essentially the same as Gzeirot, except that what they're doing is not telling you not to do something, but telling you to do something. They establish a positive rule in order to protect our practice of the Torah. Again, all the other details are the same. Finally, we arrive at the post-Talmudic era. We've talked about Anshe Knesset Gdolah. We've talked about the Tanaim. We've talked about the Zugot. The Tanaim. We've talked about the Amoraim. Now we have a few generations left. And I'm going to pause here and make a third video, actually, so that this can kind of separate and ruminate in your head. And we'll talk about the post-Talmudic era in the next video.